Right, thanks very much. Great to be back. I really enjoyed last year's conference here and really enjoyed Sean's excellent contribution this morning. And I was talking to Sean outside. It's amazing how one county differs to another, and we're going to see that in terms of the role IRA men played in Clare and how it was more rural than urban, and how Sean talked about it was mostly urban guys who were ex-soldiers in Tipperary. Anyway, this quote here: "They were right to suspect me. Lots of ex-soldiers were murderers." We'll get to the origin of that quote in a few minutes, but ex-soldiers in Clare during the War of Independence. So the first thing I'm going to cover very quickly is how we actually talk about the First World War, or the Great War. Now today in Ireland, if you're talking about the 1916 Rising, the War of Independence, the Civil War, we argue about it. We debate about it. We say, was this killing right? Was it justified? Did they have a democratic mandate? Was it sectarian? We go through all the ins and outs of it. And that's good, that's healthy, that's necessary, because this is a complex piece of history. But when it comes to the First World War, which is key to understanding 1916 and the revolution and everything that came after, I don't think we discuss it in the same complexity. We talk about it in terms of facts and figures. Oh, X number of Irishmen were involved, they were involved in this campaign, this division, but we don't really get down to the nitty-gritty and the dirt of it. Another thing we don't talk about is why they joined up. We get a very simplistic view. It was about Home Rule. All the Unionists joined to oppose Home Rule, and all the Nationalists who joined supported it. Well, if you actually look at the recruitment figures for 1915, you have 51,000 Irishmen volunteer to join. Of those, about 11,000 are members of the National Volunteers. So they're obviously probably joining up because of Redmond's call to support Home Rule. Then in terms of the Ulster Volunteers who are joining up to oppose Home Rule, you have about 8,000. But that leaves us with 32,000 men who joined that year who have no political affiliation. Now I'm going to suggest there's far more basic reasons why they're joining. Economic reasons, poverty. How many Irishmen joined from Dublin in the aftermath of the 1913 lockout? Because there was no other job opportunities. The impact of atrocity propaganda, poor Catholic Belgium, German Huns bayoneting babies, all that kind of stuff was played out in the newspapers. That probably had a big role in people joining as well. Peer pressure, social pressures, women walking down the street, why aren't you at the front? Here's a white feather, you're a coward. Priests, the Bishop of London, the Catholic Bishop of London, said that the First World War was a holy crusade, and anyone who joined up and was killed in it fighting the Germans would go straight to heaven. What impact did that have on our young Irishmen from a Catholic background in London? So Sean has alluded to some of the more complex reasons why people would have joined up and military traditions, but it's a lot more complicated than the image we see here from the War Illustrated, The Miracle of Ireland by John Redmond. And interesting, you can't read it here probably with the resolution, but the quote on the bottom for Redmond is, Ireland is not merely fighting for England, she is fighting for the Empire. You have to look, when you look at Redmond, look at the politics of the party, and they're very, very conservative, very nationalist, very pro-empire, pro-monarchy. We never ask as well, how was the war fought? We talk about thousands of Irishmen at the front, we don't ask what they did there. Look, for example, at Lieutenant John Stanforth. Now, he's in the Leinster Regiment, probably an Englishman, given the name, probably an officer. And he says in June 1916, he witnessed members of his regiment, the Leinster Regiment, kill 6 unarmed German prisoners at Vermey after discovering the body of one of their own officers who'd been killed in battle. Reprisal killings. We talk about it in the First World War, in the War of Independence. We don't talk about it in the First World War. We talk about the controversies about the shooting of spies in the War of Independence. Was it right? Was it just? Were there other agendas? Look here at Private B.W. Page, London Irish Rifles. And he talks about a telephone was found in the house of a local peasant girl who was friendly with British troops. This was in Belgium. The discovery was considered proof that she was a spy, a German spy, so they took out all their family and shot them. Private Jimmy O'Brien in the Dublin Fusiliers, told by his chaplain, here's the exact quote, "Don't take prisoners, kill them. If you take prisoners, they've got to be fed by your rations, so you'll get half rations. The answer is, don't take prisoners, kill them." The priest obviously had a great appetite. But these are the things we don't talk about in the conduct of the war, and let's not fool ourselves. Any war contains, and any army will eventually at some stage commit war crimes, there will be atrocities. It's not the heroic stuff you see in movies a lot of the time. And we never hear finally what the war was about. This is the inscription from the grave of the unknown warrior in, I think, Westminster Abbey. And it talks about the many multitudes who gave their lives for God, for king and country, for loved ones, home and empire, the sacred cause of justice and the freedom of the world. Now, was that what the war was about, or is that just rhetoric? A lot of people, I think, would argue the war was just about imperial rivalry. And my favourite quote, this is the body of a dead German soldier from the First World War. My favourite quote comes from Philip Gibbs, who was a war correspondent. Started out initially very pro-war. When he saw the horrors of what was happening, he changed his mind. And he described the First World War as a monstrous massacre of human beings who prayed to the same gods, loved the same joys of life, and had no hatred for each other, except that which was stirred up in them by their governors, their philosophers, and their newspapers. You all with me so far? Yeah? I'm not boring you with this yet? Not yet, well, before we're finished. So look, getting into the meat and bones of it, Clare Man in the First World War. This is a photograph of Private Patrick Halloran. He's in the Connacht Rangers, saying goodbye to his mother and sister, Ennis Diamond. He was killed a few months after that photograph was taken. The exact number of Clare Men who fought in the First World War is unknown. In fact, the number of Irishmen who were involved is unknown, because there were guys in the American military, there were guys in the Royal Navy, in the Australian forces. Just because someone's in the Connacht Rangers doesn't mean they're from Connacht. They could be from England, they could be an English officer in there, we don't know. In terms of Clare Men, it's estimated that somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 joined. Majority of those would have been in the British Army. You get communities like Cuna in southeast Clare, on the banks of the Shannon, just outside Limerick City, would have been very Republican. There would have been an opposition to joining the British Army, but joining the Royal Navy, because it was a fishing community, was considered fine and acceptable. A lot of Clare Men had emigrated to the US, and if they were on hard times, would join up there, and some of them may have been drafted as well. Australia and New Zealand, Clare Men out there who had emigrated as well, ended up enlisting. So it's not just the British Army we need to look at when we're talking about ex-soldiers. The number of Clare Men killed in the First World War is also uncertain. Again, probably around 500 to 650 killed. There is a book out, Tom Burnell, The Clare War Dead, but even in that he includes British fatalities from the War of Independence and the Russian Civil War, so it's difficult to be conclusive. But it's fair to say that probably several thousand ex-soldiers returned to Clare. This is one of those who didn't, William Bentley, from Brickhill in Cratloe, southeast Clare. He's killed in France, note the date, November 22nd, 1918. 11 days after the First World War ends. How he was killed, pieces come in, he's out in the battlefield, he has a stretcher with him, he's picking up bodies and bringing them back for burial. And he spots a concertina on the ground. And apparently he was, being a Clare man, he was into music, leant over to pick up the concertina, it exploded, booby trap bomb. He was killed at the front. And interestingly, 3 brothers went out. He was killed. 2 brothers came back from the First World War. Both of them were involved in the IRA locally. I'm just going to talk a bit about the current academic theories about ex-soldiers in the First World War. This is Professor David Fitzpatrick of Trinity College, Dublin. He says several hundred supposed informers were murdered, sometimes in a gruesome fashion. Though many of the dead had indeed tipped off the police or the castle, others were the victims of numerous or paranoid assumptions. Adulterers, homosexuals, tinkers, beggars, ex-servicemen, Protestants. There were many dangerous and potentially lethal labels for Ireland's inhabitants in the revolutionary period. The purity of the fight, the War of Independence, had been sullied even in Republican consciousness well before the truce. Now, this is something I take issue with. Not only does Fitzpatrick not give a quote or examples, or here he doesn't give a reference, the other thing is, it seems to me like he's deliberately trying to pick out minorities. For example, homosexuals. Homosexuality was illegal at the time. How does he know who was homosexual or how someone would have been killed? How someone would have been killed for that reason? I've been through hundreds of files looking at the shooting of ex-soldiers and suspected spies in the National Archives in Britain, and I've never seen that come up or even alluded to. Protestants, there have been claims that this was sectarian, the shooting of spies. And another thing you'll see in the newspapers at the time, and repeated in some research, is that it was about the shooting of spies was used to kill ex-soldiers because there was prejudice against them. I have a book coming out next year. This is some of the data from it. This is a graph giving you the number of number of suspected spies killed by county. So it's broken down as well into green, orange and blue. Green are Catholics, orange are Protestants, blue is unknown or undetermined religion. So if we look at Limerick, for example, all 7 of those killed are all Catholics. If we look at Cork, I think it's 45 Catholics killed, 21 Protestants, which is a very high number. But as you have to remember, there was a very strong loyalist Protestant community in Cork City and in towns in West Cork like Bandon. And if you look at the overall picture, you're talking about 71% of those killed as alleged spies in the War of Independence being Catholic. Less than a quarter were Protestants. So to me, this raises questions about the sectarian allegations that have been raised. Looking at the subject we have today, the previous military experience were ex-soldiers shot as spies simply because there was prejudice against ex-soldiers. Well, here it's not quite as clear-cut as the religious one. 46% of those killed had no military or police service. Some of those would have been women who were shot as spies who wouldn't have been eligible anyway. 48%, it's quite large, were ex-British Army and a few ex-Royal Navy. About 4% ex-RIC constables and 2% IRA volunteers. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. Were the IRA prejudiced against ex-soldiers? Jane Leonard says that ex-soldiers were hated and despised by the IRA for having served in the British Army. She says, quote, within the nationalist community, ex-soldiers weakened the revolution's effectiveness by refusing to join Sinn Féin, subscribe to its funds or obey the rulings of its courts. I'm not too sure about this. Anybody recognise this young man on the left? That's Private Tom Barry of the Royal Field Artillery on his way to Mesopotamia, I think Iraq. So Tom Barry, one of the most famous IRA officers of the period, had served in the British Army. Emma Dalter, Director of Training for the IRA headquarters, ex-British Army. Sinn Féin, Robert Barton, leading member of Sinn Féin, ex-British soldier. In fact, he had been in charge of Republican prisoners in Dublin in Easter 1916. Erskine Childers, again, leading member of Sinn Féin. And William Corrie, an ex-British soldier from Dublin, says that during his time in the IRA in Dublin, he says, I met, quote, hundreds of ex-servicemen. So if there were hundreds of ex-soldiers in the IRA in Dublin, what does that say about the rest of the country? So if we look at County Clare specifically, there was a latent sympathy amongst people who had joined up because of Home Rule or people who came from the same communities, the same backgrounds as IRA men for this Sinn Féin Republican IRA cause. For example, during the 1917 East Clare election, Countess Markavitch, we see her, that's her here in the white, she's marching through Ennis. She was canvassing for De Valera in the East Clare election, and she was travelling on a train from Kilrush to Ennis. Interesting that although a TD, she wasn't travelling first class. She was travelling in a carriage with a group of ex-soldiers. I think TDs, I'm open to correction on this, but weren't initially paid. I think they got expenses and a third-class rail ticket. But while on the train, she meets Private John Bulger of the Australia and New Zealand Corps, Private Patrick Kane of the Munster Fusiliers, and Private Michael Kane, his brother, again of the Munster Fusiliers. And she saw them in their British uniform and started berating them. You're fighting in the wrong war, you're doing the wrong thing, why fight for Belgium's freedom, you should be fighting for Ireland. And by the time the train journey had finished, she had actually convinced them all of her side of the argument. And when they arrived in Ennis, they sought out local IRA men and gave them their rifles. Didn't ask for money, just handed them over. And all 3 of them were court-martialed for this. Private Bulger got off with a stern warning. The British forces, the Commonwealth forces, were very careful with Australian, New Zealand troops in terms of sentencing them to death, because a number of Australians, I think, had been killed in the Boer War. That had been very controversial. They'd been executed, and that meant when it came to the First World War, they were kind of hands-off, didn't treat them as harshly. Michael Kane was sentenced to 6 months continuous service at the front without reprieve. That's very close to being a death sentence, but he wasn't killed. Patrick Kane was sentenced to death, but then it was commuted to continuous service at the front, which basically, you know, there's a year of the war left. If you're out there every day, the likelihood is you're going to be killed. Of course, they didn't know it was coming to an end, but he later won a reprieve because he rescued a wounded British officer from no man's land. The Rineen ambush, some of you will have heard of it. Ex-soldiers play a very important role in this. September 22nd, 1920, the largest ambush that's happened in the War of Independence at that stage. 6 members of the British forces, 5 RIC and 1 Black and Tan are killed. And it's followed by widespread reprisals. You can see them here, the Milltown Malbay, the Hinch, the Scanner, and Ennistimon. During these reprisals, 5 civilians and 1 IRA volunteer are killed by the British forces. This includes a 12-year-old girl, Nora Fox, and a 15-year-old boy, PJ LeMan. About 70 houses and businesses are destroyed and damaged, including the property of local loyalists. And this is where I got the quote at the beginning from. This takes me to John Burke. He's an ex-soldier from Lahinch, and he's applying in the 1920s for compensation from the British government. And he talks about how he's victimised by Republicans for being an ex-soldier, but he also has this as part of his statement. It was well known by the British military that I was an ex-soldier, and on the night of the Rineen reprisals, 22nd to 23rd of September 1920, the Crown forces drove into my place prior to the burning of Lahinch. So one of the first places they call is his house. A handful of them got out of control and did a lot of damage to my premises. After their leaving my place, it presented a veritable scene of wreckage. They were aware at the time that a number of ex-soldiers, underlined in the original, had taken part in the Rineen murders, that's the ambush, and naturally they were entitled to a certain extent to lose confidence in all ex-soldiers in the locality. So why are the Black and Tans and the RIC going to ex-soldiers first when they're looking for Republicans to attack? Well, the answer is, despite what Jane Leonard says, it's because so many ex-soldiers were in the IRA and were in leading positions in the IRA. For example, the person who led that ambush, Commandant Ignatius ONeill, he had joined the Irish Guards in 1914. He had been in America as well, and I think he may have served briefly in the US military. He was a veteran of Ypres, he was a veteran of the Somme, and he's the guy who led that attack, the Rineen ambush. A key person in that attack was volunteer Peter Vaughan. He had emigrated to America before the War of Independence. He joined the 69th New York Regiment, served on the Western Front in 1918 in the last few months of the war, came back home to Ireland. The IRA for the Rineen attack had 2 grenades. They gave them to this guy. He was the only one with experience in using them. And I think there was even an ex-member of the RIC involved in the Rineen attack as well. So there's quite a number of ex-soldiers. So word has obviously gotten back to the British that it's ex-soldiers that are leading these attacks, and that's why, as John Burke says, they're raiding their houses. Here's another example. This is Martin Doyle in his British Army uniform. He's a Wexford man, shaking hands with Queen Mary after being decorated by King George V, May of 1919. What was he decorated for? Well, he got the Victoria Cross, the highest British award for gallantry, and he was given that for service on the Western Front. He led an attack against great odds at Ruairc in France to rescue a party of British infantry and their wounded officer. As soon as he's back from that, there's a tank crew in difficulty. He goes out into no man's land and basically rescues them. And finally, he single-handedly overruns a German machine gun position, and on his way back carries a wounded soldier to safety. There's no doubt about this guy's bravery in the face of fire. In 1920, after he'd come back, a few months after he's been awarded the Victoria Cross by the King, he joins the IRA's Mid-Clare Brigade as an intelligence officer working in Ennis. Who in the British is going to stop and search a guy who's wearing a Victoria Cross? In 1922, he joined the Free State Army. He served until 1937. He dies in 1940, so that's before the Bureau of Military History. It's before the First World or the War of Independence pension applications, so we don't have too much other information about him. We do have more about this guy, Colonel Patrick A. Mulcahy, brother of Richard Mulcahy. Would I be correct, Pat, in saying they were Waterford men? Yeah, okay. Served in the Royal Engineers. He's demobilised from Wales in 1919. Now, he made a statement to the British, or to the Bureau of Military History, and he talks in it about before they're demobilised, the officer stands up and gives them a lecture on the dangers of what will happen when they go home and Sinn Féiners and all this. And Mulcahy shouts out, "I'm sick of this, lads," and walks off, and the regiment follows him. In 1920, he's in Clare. He's back in his old job in the post office. And what's he doing? He's working for IRA intelligence. He is decoding the RIC telegrams going back and forward, warning of raids, making arrangements, patrols, troop movements, and all that information is going to the IRA. In fact, he claims that during the Rineen ambush that he played a crucial part. The telegrams were coming through the office calling for British reinforcements, and he was delaying them all for 15, 20 minutes to give his IRA comrades out on the hillside in Rineen a bit more time. He ends up as Chief of Staff of the Irish Army from 1955 to 59. Commandant Paddy McMahon joined the British Army in the First World War, served on the Western Front, came back to his native Ennis, joined the IRA. Commandant of the local battalion, worked in intelligence in Ennis. Very interesting anti-clerical streak to the man. There's a great story about he was in a bank in Ennis, robbing it for presumably IRA funds rather than his own. And Bishop Fogarty, a fair-weather supporter of republicanism, was at the counter making a withdrawal, and he didn't want to get out of the way despite the little man with a revolver. So Con McMahon told him he had a much greater need for the money and pushed the bishop aside. Con McMahon led an attack on Shaughnessy's, a loyalist pub in Ennis that was serving British soldiers despite warnings that they should be boycotted, and he threw a grenade into the pub, killing Sergeant Roux of the Royal Scots, 16th of April 1921. He organised the rescue of IRA prisoners from British custody. He was allegedly involved in the assassination of John Gunn, who was an RIC sergeant shot during the truce period. And during the Civil War, he took the Republican side. He was interned in Mountjoy, and he shared a cell with Liam Mellows, who was executed. He later became a builder and owned a dance hall in Ennis, so apparently quite a character. Joseph Clancy, training officer for the East Clare Brigade IRA, ran away from home at the age of 16 to join the Munster Fusiliers. This is another reason why people join up. As Tom Barry said, he didn't join for anything to do with politics. It was about excitement, travel and adventure. He goes to the Western Front. He's discharged as medically unfit, and he comes back home, joins the Kilkishen Company of the IRA. He's involved in robbing a post office to get IRA funds. He's imprisoned for his role in that. He's released after going on hunger strike. He's involved in the attack on Scariff RIC barracks, on an RIC patrol in Broadford, the Cratlow ambush, the Glenwood ambush. I could go on. You get the picture. He is one of the most active members of the IRA in East Clare, which was a very one of the strongest, I would argue, units in the country at the time. And he's involved in the execution of Constable Daniel A. Murphy, a black and tan from Cork, captured while he was carrying out intelligence duties. So we'll go back to Jane Leonard again. Ex-soldiers were hated and despised by the IRA for having served in the British Army. Ex-soldiers weakened the revolution's effectiveness and refused to join the IRA or Sinn Féin. Nonsense. The reality is that the IRA were armed, trained and led by ex-soldiers, in Clare at any rate, and I would suspect in a lot of other parts of the country. Look at this photograph of IRA men training during the truce period. Look at how they're shouldering their rifles. Look at how they're formed up. These are men who've been taught by someone who knows what they're doing, drill and military discipline. Many of these guys may be ex-soldiers. I would say they've almost certainly been trained by one. So they're the ex-soldiers who come home and join the IRA. Another side to this is that you get ex-soldiers coming home and joining the British forces. Now, as Sean pointed out, the story about black and tans being the scum of British prisons, that's propaganda from the time. They were ex-soldiers, most of them from Britain, but quite a number of them Irishmen as well. These are Irish loyalists who were joining up. 42 black and tans from County Clare and 15 members of the auxiliaries came from County Clare. If you have any relatives or friends in Clare, I named them all in the book I wrote in the county, so you can go looking. We'll just look here at the 15 auxiliaries who came from Clare. Look at the top one, Thomas Gore Hickman, Protestant ex-officer in the British Army. He is the son of a very wealthy local landlord. He's probably joining up for King and Country. He sees the Sinn Féin and the IRA as Bolsheviks, anarchists. That's probably his take on things. And he's from a Southern Orange family. But look at the rest. Thomas Conlon, Patrick Cullinan, Burke, Keshan, Malone, Noonan, Malone, all Catholics. All ex-soldiers or ex-officers from the British Army. These are not Southern Orangemen. Some of these may be the guys who went out to fight for Home Rule. They've come back and look at where they've ended up. G Company of the Auxiliaries, Sean talked about them, based in Killaloo, Ballina. Here they are outside the Lakeside Hotel in Killaloo, nicknamed the Body Snatchers. Not entirely sure how. But what I find very interesting is that Patrick Keshan, Joseph Malone, Francis Noonan, William Malone, their numbers are all consecutive. They walked into the recruiting office on the one day at the one time. They're all ex-soldiers and they're all from the town in Killaloo. They're joining a British unit that is stationed in Killaloo. That is exceptionally unusual. That says to me that what these guys are doing, they're not going around in uniform. They're probably being used for intelligence work. They're people with local knowledge, local accents, who know the people who can identify them. And that is far more valuable to the British than a guy who can carry a rifle. You look, as Sean mentioned there, the Scariff Markers killed in Killaloo Bridge. Michael McMahon, Alfred Rogers, Martin Gilday, 3 of them members of the IRA, the 4th Michael Egan, civilian killed with them, all picked up and summary executed while prisoners. And local information is thought to have been responsible for them being captured. And again, you have to ask, did these local men in the auxiliaries take part in this? Did they guide it? Did they go down to the bar and listen? So ex-soldiers and British intelligence in County Clare. On the left there, you'll see a spy warning, do not associate with the British forces, do not drink with them, do not give them information, issued by Michael Brennan and the East Clare Brigade. 3 spies, alleged spies, killed by the IRA in Clare during the War of Independence. Every county is different. You cannot do what I would argue as Peter Hart did and take a study of Cork and say, this is the situation there, and extrapolate out from that what's happening in the rest of the country. Using statistics and so forth. You have to look at the cases, the people, the counties individually. Martin Coonan, Catholic process server, John Riley, Catholic groundskeeper, ex-soldier, and Patrick Darcy, a teacher and an IRA volunteer, were killed as spies. All spies killed in Clare were Catholic. Okay? No Protestants here, no question of sectarianism involved in this. If you wanted a statistic, you could say that the IRA were prejudiced against Catholics in Clare, but that's clearly nonsense. You can play around too much with statistics. One of them's a civilian, one of them's an ex-IRA volunteer, one of them, Riley, is a British soldier. Again, if you were trying to play statistics, you could say that they were as likely to kill an ex-IRA officer as they were kill an ex-British soldier, but that's clearly nonsense. Again, just be careful of statistics. Riley, from Newmarket and Fergus, is the only ex-soldier killed in Clare as an alleged spy. We don't know exactly how, but local IRA volunteers claim that he was involved in betraying these men, Patrick and Harry Loughnane, who were killed on the Clare-Galway border at Shanaglesh near Gort. They were arrested by the auxiliaries, they disappeared from auxiliary custody, and their bodies were found a few days later, and this is what they looked like. You'll notice that Patrick's head from the jaw is missing. Apparently the bodies have been burned. There was a diamond carved into one of their torsos. Now, interestingly, the flash worn by the local auxiliary company behind their cap badge was a diamond. They're mutilating the bodies. They've been dragged along behind behind trucks, and apparently they tried to destroy the bodies by using grenades. So this is why most of Patrick's head is missing and one of his arms, I think, as well. But in terms of this man, Riley, this is a compensation claim made by his wife. And you can see Mary Riley, Newmarket and Fergus, applying in relation of John Riley, ex-soldier, she's his widow. She applies for £5,000 compensation. She gets £1,200 compensation, an exceptionally large amount of money. And the key thing is, written over it in red, agreed to accept as British liability. Only 3 of the 60 applicants in Clare are agreed British liability. They're the same 3 guys who the IRA allege were shot for spying. And the phrase, agreed to accept as British liability, it's not used in all the cases where spies were shot, just some of them. And if you read Gemma Clark's new book on violence in the Civil War, it's the exact same phrase that the British use when they're compensating RIC men and British soldiers killed during the conflict. So to me, this is pretty conclusive that Riley probably had an association, may have been spying for the British forces. But unfortunately, when I went to get the file itself, like the files of all other alleged spies shot during the period, they had disappeared. The file before them is there, the file after them is there, but it looks to me like they've been taken out of the records at some point. To wrap up very quickly, World War I would argue, as it is currently shown in the Irish narrative, particularly in the media, is very simplistic. It's very sanitised. The same kind of dirty stuff, reprisal killings, execution of spies that happened in the War of Independence also happened in the First World War. Many ex-soldiers who returned to Ireland joined the IRA. Their military experience was valued by the IRA, and many of them, particularly in Clare, became leading IRA officers. IRA units were armed, trained and led by ex-British soldiers. Other Irish soldiers who came back joined the Black and Tans, the auxiliaries, and re-enlisted in the British Army. And I would argue that as Irishmen and locals, these ex-soldiers were probably of great value for intelligence work. They could do undercover work, they could work as identifiers, as guides, even as translators. The British forces down in Skibbereen couldn't understand the local accent. So they got Scottish soldiers from the Highlands in who spoke Scots Gaelic. They thought the locals were speaking Irish. But if you've ever been to Skibbereen, it was just the accent. But again, a local guy is going to be able to sit in the bar and listen to what people are saying. So I'd argue that's what they're used for. Ex-soldiers probably also worked as intelligence agents, spies and informers for the British forces. They were very useful for this work. They probably joined because they were loyalists. They joined maybe out of a sense of comradeship. Might have been because they were in poverty, or maybe because a lot of ex-soldiers suffering from post-traumatic stress would have had problems with alcohol. Most probably avoided politics and warfare and tried to get on with their lives, and probably were sick of war, didn't take part in the revolution. Shameless piece of self-promotion. There's my books. They're available at the back. Slightly less shameful piece of self-promotion. We have booklets on sale at the back. I'm involved in the local committee erecting monuments in Clare, and if anyone wants my opinions on how commemorations are done, this guy's the local Fianna Fáil councillor, and this guy's the local Fine Gael organiser, and they're at the one event. I've ended the Civil War single-handedly. That's the last monument we put up. Volunteer Robert Byrne, a Limerick man killed in Clare, just over the border. First Republican fatality of the War of Independence. And finally, you don't have to fork out any money. It's all available free online, warofindependence.info. Thank you very much.